Hi, Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon. Can everyone hear me? Nadia, just checking. Yeah, thank you. Welcome to today's webinar entitled Enhancing the Effectiveness of Online Assessment, an event brought to you by the Malaysian Association of Language and Testing, or MALT, in collaboration with UiTM's Academic Assessment and Evaluation Division, or the Bahagian Pentaksiran dan Penilaian Academic, BPPA. I am Aisha Johari, your moderator for today, alongside Dr. Nadia Hani Nazlan, Head of Assessment and Evaluation Development for BPPA on the tech. Before we begin, we have a short video clip from the president of MALT. This is Professor Dr. Saidatul Akmal Zainal Abidin to talk a little bit about the association. Nadia, if we could play the video, please.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very good day to all. First and foremost, I would like to thank the BPPA, or Bahagian Penilaian Pentaksiran Academic UiTM, for their willingness to collaborate with MALT for this event. I would also like to thank all participants present here today for this webinar, everyone from within UiTM as well as outside. Thank you all. I would like to share with you briefly about MALT. MALT, or Malaysian Association for Language Testing, and our main aim is to take on a role of a specialist in the field, and for the theory as well as practical purposes. We are willing to collaborate, or we will collaborate, with educational institutions as well as governmental agencies. And MALT has been in existence only for the past less than 6 years. So we have a new website at malaysiamalt.com, and we welcome everyone to join MALT as a member. The link for membership will be posted in the chat box of this webinar. So thank you very much again for attending this webinar, as I am sure it will be very beneficial for you. The speaker is our very own Professor Barry O'Sullivan. Thank you.
That was the president of the Malaysian Association for Language Testing, or MALT, Professor Dr. Saidatul Akmal Zainal Abidin. For more information on MALT, do visit their website at malaysiamalt.com. Speaking of MALT, our invited speaker for today is the International Advisor to MALT, Professor Barry O'Sullivan. Thank you for joining us all the way from Ireland. Good morning.
Good morning.
While Professor Barry is setting up his slides for us, let me read his bio really quickly. Professor Barry O'Sullivan is MALT's International Advisor. He is currently the Head of Assessment Research and Development at the British Council, where he was responsible for the design and development of the APTIS test service. He has undertaken research across many areas on language testing and assessment and its history for 25 years, and has worked on the development and refinement of the socio-cognitive model of test development and validation since 2000. He is particularly interested in the communication of test validation and in test localization. He is the founding president of the UK Association of Language Testing and Assessment, or UCALTA, and holds honorary and visiting chairs at a number of universities globally. In 2016, he was awarded Fellowship of the Academy of Social Science in the UK and was elected to Fellowship of the Asian Association for Language Assessment in 2017. Just a quick announcement before we begin. We are currently live on YouTube, so if the audience has any questions or comments, you may use the chat box once you have subscribed to the channel. I will then read out the questions, if any, once Prof. Barry has delivered his talk. So without further ado, let's pass the screen over to you, Prof.
Hi, good morning. I'm about to attempt to share my screen. I hope you're seeing this.
Yes, we can. That's right. I'm right here.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the MALT for this invitation and to give me the opportunity to talk about a subject that I'm particularly interested in these days. We've been doing quite a bit of work at the British Council in the area of online assessment, as you can imagine, and particularly in the area of integrating artificial intelligence into online assessment. And that's the angle I plan to take today when I'm talking about enhancing the effectiveness of online assessments, because more and more we're seeing AI play a role in assessment at all stages, and I'll talk a little bit about that. First of all, we'll think about a couple of issues with online assessment that I see that have emerged over the last 2 years, really, since the world has gone crazy, basically, and we've not had much opportunity to do anything else except online assessment. So some of the issues that have emerged over the time are related to test delivery. And some of the things that we're working on at the moment is test generation. So we're trying to see if we can use artificial intelligence to help us to actually generate the tests themselves. We do that with, at the moment, artificial intelligence, AI-assisted technology to help us to create texts and to create items related to those texts, particularly for reading and listening. And we have had a reasonable amount of success with that. We're moving on now to look at areas such as automatic item difficulty generation, which is of particular interest. It's a tough nut to crack, and a lot of people in the US particularly have been trying to do it now for some time, but without very much success. I probably think that the lack of success is due to the approach, which is purely a measurement-driven approach, and it's just not enough. There's not enough information in the numbers. We need more information. So that's how we're tackling it. Another area that we've seen AI come to the fore is with security and particularly at-home test delivery, and almost as many solutions to the problem as problems as you can imagine. Every system that I know of that's out there has been hacked at some stage by somebody. It's a very tough nut to crack. AI isn't all it's made out to be. The facial recognition software isn't great. It's okay. If you're a white middle class or middle-aged male, it will recognize you 94% to 6% of the time. If you're a young black woman, it's probably down to 54% or less. So we can't fully rely on the technology. The other problem is that we know from bitter experience in trying out systems that we take as much human time checking all of the issues that these automatic systems flag up. So we really don't have a lot of time to do things. We don't save the kind of money we think we would have saved by having one person look after a number of test takers, for example. The other key issue that I see is in test scoring. And that's where we're going to look mostly today, to be honest. We're looking at human versus machine. Which way do we go? What are the kind of decisions we need to make? What are the pitfalls? What are the benefits to going one way or the other? And the critical area, of course, of bias that nobody really talks about. Bias within automatic scoring systems is a critical issue that's essentially ignored. And ignored by companies and ignored by us users. Up to now, I don't believe it will stay that way for very long. I'm going to focus on this area and these two topics for the rest of today, while looking at it all through the lens of the artificial intelligence and how we can use that and how it is used and what are the benefits and what are the, I guess, distractions that there are, because we tend to, maybe it's a human thing, we tend to trust that this stuff works without question in many cases. But it's time to question, as we will find today. But before people think that I'm against AI, I think I'd like to set the record clear. I think it's a very exciting technology. It helps us with speed of response. For example, if you participate in a test from me, I can get a response back to you, a score back to you almost instantaneously. Saves a lot of money for test companies. It costs money, of course, to build the systems. It also costs money every time somebody goes through the system, but it actually is still cheaper than having human raters. Not as cheap as people think it might be, but it still is cheap. It's still worth a good investment. You get consistency of rating, relatively good consistency, at least as good as humans, but consistency isn't always related to accuracy, of course, but it is consistent. And there is nowadays an ease of integration. We can integrate our systems easily because of APIs. And these automatic program interfaces. These are essentially small programs that allow two computers or two computer systems to talk to each other. So we can integrate APIs into our system much more easily than, let's say, 20 to 30 years ago, where systems were hardwired, they were built as a block. Nowadays, we don't build it as a block. We build it as like a Lego piece. And we can easily take one piece out and replace it with another one of the same size, same shape, same color. But think of Lego when you're building some of these systems now. It also has lots of potential. So as I said earlier, we're currently looking at auto development of items and auto estimation of item difficulty. But we're also exploring the possibility of personalization, where you get tests that are fitted to you precisely as possible. So the texts that you read will be texts that you are either familiar with the topic or that you are happy with. So there are different ways of looking at this, but the idea of personalization is clearly the future. Personalization to the extent that I can see a time in the not too distant future where we won't have a need for a face-to-face test at the end of a program of study. If it's a digital program of study, we will automatically be capturing all of the data, and there will be an underlying measurement and assessment model within the learning system, which will tell us when you have reached the expected level of proficiency. We're actually working on a project like that in that area with our colleagues in English at the British Council right now, and we hope to have that out in the next year. So that is coming. This area of personalization is fantastically interesting as well. When we start to think then of the human versus machine, there's a range of choices. How can we deal with it? Well, a few years back, actually 4 years back, I started to work on a matrix, which we've now more or less completed. And the matrix gives us 6 levels of decision, from human only to machine only. Now, I expect that if some people are watching this on a laptop, you're not going to be able to read it, but that doesn't matter. You can see it later. The human only is where there's no machine involved. It's simply a human scoring it. Machine only is where there's no human involved. There's only a machine scoring it. At the moment, there is no system that I'm aware of that has machine only. This is because even some systems that are out there that claim to be machine only, the machine gives a score, but if the machine for some reason is not able to give a score because of recording quality or because it just cannot understand what the person has said, which does happen quite a bit, it then goes on to human raters. So we always have a human backup in the system these days. At some stage, we may see tests that go to machine only. We have tests, I should say that there are some tests that are machine only, but they tend to be low stakes. And, I'll actually mention one of them a bit later in the talk, but it's a low stakes placement test. So essentially you have a system where you have a human primary or machine secondary. So the human makes all of the major decisions, and the machine is either confirms that score or says, are you sure? Or else the machine will look at the same criteria as human, or it may look at some slightly different criteria. Machine human equal is where the human looks at some part, the machine looks at the other part. Machines are pretty good at counting stuff, and machines are pretty good at grammar and vocabulary and that kind of thing. Stuff that can be counted. Humans are, let's face it, not great at it. So we can ask the human to look after the content and the machine to look after the accuracy and complexity of the language, for example. That's number 3. And number 4, we're starting to look at the machine primary. So the machine gives the scores, and the human is called in then in special cases, if you like. Then that is where EDI, equality, diversity, and inclusion cases, where the machine may struggle. The machine may not have been trained adequately to deal with people who have EDI requirements. So then those are automatically scored by human. Then number 5, the machine primary, the machine awards a score. The human only looks at scores that either the machine can't do, or we look at a random selection of scores, and 6 is machine only. So those are your options that we see it, and all of these come with massive development issues and planning issues, ethical issues that we must face as an organization when we're creating an assessment. At the moment, the movement is towards human in the loop, which generally means either a 3 or a 4. We don't see many systems where the human in the loop gives the human the primary role, because I think probably because test organizations are if they put the human in the main role, it's still going to cost money. They're not going to save very much money by having a machine. But some organizations do that, and it seems to work for them. So we could probably say we're looking middle. And a test like IELTS will be 1 human only, of course. A test like PTE is probably 5, and a test like IB TOEFL is probably 2, to give you an idea of what major exams do with regard to all of this. However, there is something we have to think about when you think about this whole idea of a matrix and deciding who scores what. Because if we go back to how these models are built, I came across this a little while back, Evanini, Hauck, and Hakuta. And This is a paper they wrote. It's an ETS publication. And it's not necessarily just for English, by the way. This is for, it is for language, but not necessarily English as a foreign language. And they say that this is how their system is built. So it starts with designing tasks informed by strengths and weaknesses of AI scoring. Then they ensure the response capture infrastructure is in place. Basically, they build a system to capture the data. So that's your app, or that's your test delivery system. Then you connect spoken responses in the pilot. You obtain the double scores from human raters. You transcribe them, the responses, so that you have a recording, you have a transcription, and you have scores. You use those to build the scoring models and the ASR model. So that's essentially how the system works to give a score. And then you evaluate the scoring performance and you make decisions. One of the reasons you do a transcription is because all of these systems are text to score systems. So if it's written, you've properly typed the text into your computer. So the text is already there. So then you just stick it into the system and it gives a score. If it's speaking, it's got to listen to you. It's got to turn what you've said into a text and then give it a score. So you can then compare the text that the machine has produced with the text that you have produced from the transcription. And you calculate what's called a word error rate, and you see how accurate the machine has been. Because the machine isn't going to be accurate all the time. And we have to remember that the machine isn't scoring the actual spoken performance. It's scoring the written transcription of the spoken performance. Now, when we think about it, there are a couple of danger zones around here. The first danger zone, I'll come back and say why I think it's a danger zone. But we have 4 really critical danger zones. Every single box is a potential danger zone, but these are the big ones. Now let's think about the first one. If we think about the first box there, if you're designing tasks informed by strengths and weaknesses of AI scoring, there's a real strong possibility that you're designing tasks that are inappropriate to the construct of speaking that you're trying to assess. And you're going to end up with a test like Duolingo, for example, which is a test of, people are opening their mouth and making sounds, but God knows what this test is actually testing. But Duolingo pride themselves. They don't just say, they don't hide behind anything. They pride themselves on saying, oh, we built our system based on the strengths of the AI scoring system. So they are testing what they can measure. They're not actually testing what they need to test. So you can really wind yourself down into a black hole by going that direction. For me, if that's your starting point to create a test, you're finished. The rest of it is not going to work. You'll get a score at the end, but it's meaningless. It doesn't tell you anything about a person's ability to speak. So let's say that's critical. If you go that direction, end the story. Walk away. Your test is over. The next one, collect the spoken responses in the pilot test. Now we'll talk about that in a moment because this is really, really important. They must be the right responses. They must come from the right people. They must be relevant to the tasks, and they must reflect the population. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. The quality of the human scores is absolutely critical here, because if we don't get these human scores right, it means that the scoring models that we use are built on poor data. And if they're built on poor data, they will never work. They will still give you a number, but the number is likely to be meaningless. And for some reason, I've never fully understood. We never ever question exam boards who use AI scoring systems properly. We never say, how did you obtain those scores? Who were the humans? How many were involved? How did you analyze it? We don't ask any questions. We just assume when they tell us, oh, the scoring was gold standard. I've heard one organization tell us systematically, it's obviously they're trained. It doesn't matter who tells the story about their system. They always tell us that their scores, human scores, are gold standard. And when you say, what do you mean by gold standard? They generally can't tell you. What they mean by gold standard usually is that they're trained raters, and that's not enough. And we'll talk about that. The final question that we have to ask ourselves is, evaluating the scoring performance, how do we do that? What are the kind of things we need to be thinking of? And what kind of evidence do we need? And of course, who are we evaluating it for? Is it just for ourselves, or should we be making this public? Well, I'd argue that it's the latter, that we should be thinking about how we let people know who are going to use our test, let them know how we've managed to build our system and how we've evaluated the system and how we can be sure that the system is working. All of these raise a number of important questions. The system seems to have decided not to work. We'll try another way. Let's think then of the whole area of bias, because that's probably the biggest problem that we're likely to face in an auto-scoring system that is generally ignored, to be honest, by most people who use the systems, and not reported on by people who build the systems. So let's think about it a little bit more. The first one, obtain spoken responses in the pilot test. Now, we need to know some things. Who is speaking? Is the gender, age, accent, any other feature, likely feature, is that reflective of the population who will take the test? So if I, for example, am making a national exam for speaking, and I know that the gender is like 50-50 balance, let's say, then my gender balance must reflect that. I can't have more men than women. I can't have more women than men. My age balance should also fit in here, as should the accents. If there are likely to be different accents. So if there are people in different parts of Malaysia, for example, who speak differently and whose L1 accent will impact on their L2 accent, that needs to be taken into account. So any variable we know that might impact on performance, we need to balance that in our system when we gather that information. So it must reflect the target population. So we need to know as much about that target population as we possibly can. We also need to think about things like language level. So, one example that I heard of recently is where a testing system found that women were highly unlikely to get a top score in this test. And nobody could understand why, until they went back and looked at the population that the AI scoring system model was built on. And they realized that in that model, the data indicated that there were very, very, very few women in the data set scoring highly in the test for some reason. So most of the high scores, the top scores, were men. Almost all were men. So the machine, when it starts thinking about it, reaches the conclusion, as you can imagine, well, people who sound like this, because women and men use language in different ways and they actually sound different, as you know. So people who speak like this and sound like this, the machine doesn't care whether they're a man, a woman, a beast, an elephant. The machine doesn't care. The machine just sees there's a pattern here, and the people with the low voices and the people who use these, as we know, male language types, seem to get the high scores, and these other ones don't get there. So that must be part of the solution. So the machine is building in a measurement based on an error. essentially. We also need a good spread. We need a good spread of levels from high to low. The machine needs to know, in the same way as you're dealing with rate of training, for example, in tests. You don't train raters on only good scripts, for example. You give them a good range. In the same way, you need to give a good range to an automatic scoring system. The next part then, obtaining double human scores for the pilot response. Well, because we need hundreds, if not thousands, of responses to be scored, you're not going to have just 2 judges. That's not going to work. It's impossible. It's a huge piece of work for those 2 people. So the likelihood is that you'll have multiple judges. And that brings you into a typical problem that we have. What if there's one harsh and one lenient? Or one harsh and the other harsh? Or one lenient and the other lenient? We could get a range of scores for the same performance depending on the blend of judges. So we need to think about, how do we deal with judge leniency or harshness? We need to think about each particular judge. Is that person consistent in their scoring? Are they ageist or sexist or racist or any other ist? So what about those people do I need to know? And what can I do to ensure that their biases, if you like, are not introduced into the test system? Because if bias is introduced through the raters, it means that the scores that are given reflect the biases, and then the machine system is built on biased data, and the machine system will be biased. There's no way around it. So when I hear that people have double human scores, I think that's not enough. That is not telling me anything. You know, in a recent project, we looked at 6 human scores, and we used statistics, multifaceted rash analysis, to get the probability of the true score for every performance, and that's the score we fed into the system. And we found that worked very well. But it's expensive, as you can imagine. It's much more expensive to get 6 scores than it is to get 2 scores. Evaluating the performance, how can we do it? Well, this is where we're going to go next. That's the big question. The problem is that when we look for guidance on how to do it, if we look at the standards that are out there, and those are some of the more important standards in the world, we look there, or we look to the publications, including one of my own, Validity, Theoretical Developments and Integrated Arguments, or you look in the journals, or you look to the validity theories, including our own, you find that they have one thing in common. They all fail to refer to the validation of AI model use in language tests. So up to now, language testing in general has failed us in this regard. And we have to be honest about that. So what do we do? Well, we've looked at something called model cards. These were proposed by Margaret Mitchell and a whole gang of people from Microsoft and Google in the US a few years ago. And they're designed for use for AI-driven or supported high-stakes decisions. They're designed to identify the types of evidence required for model use validation. So what kind of evidence do we need and how do we present that? And it's aimed at a largely non-technical audience. So the assumption being that most people won't have enough knowledge of AI scoring systems to understand a highly technical report. A fairly sensible requirement, to be honest, because most of us don't have a clue how these things actually work. In a model card then, the classical model card that we looked at, we have different elements. So we talk about the details of the model, the intended use, what should it be used for, what it should not be used for. What are the potential sources of bias? And that's where we look at gender and age and accent and all of these things. So we think about that from the beginning. The metrics are the measures we choose to reflect the real world impact. So how do we ensure that the data is accurate and is going to give us the right information? tell me about the training set that you used. How did you build the system? What data did you use to evaluate the system? And then the quantitative analysis is how did you actually analyze the data from the system to demonstrate that there is no bias within the system? And then the ethical considerations will be, can we justify using the model with this population for this purpose? Is there enough evidence for us to say, yes, this is good? If you want to know what a model card looks like, that is a first draft of a model card that we've produced for the IELTS Smart Learning app placement test. That's a low stakes test. The ISL is an IELTS training app that's used in China for Chinese students preparing to take IELTS. And as you can see, there's quite a lot of detail in there, but we try to keep it to 2 pages, and we try to keep it as relatively non-technical as possible. And again, we don't have time to go into the details of that here, but the idea is that we have a systematic way of presenting the data to readers so that they can make their own judgment as to the quality of the system that we're using. So a few thoughts. First of all, we should always start building the model card from day one. If you try to do it later on, as in retrofit, it's so difficult. That's what happened to us with this test, and it was so hard to do. We didn't know what to do. We didn't know where to start. Luckily, we had good partners. We had good ed tech partners, iFlyTech in China. We worked very closely with them. But it required significant learning on both sides. They needed to learn about language testing. They're a tech company. We needed to learn about tech. So we had to learn from each other. We had to learn the questions to ask, as we'll say in a minute. The process can help us to improve our scoring system dramatically. Our first iteration of the scoring system was about 54% accurate. Our final one was 91% accurate. So we really improved it dramatically. The model card, critically, it helps us as test users to know what questions to ask and how to ask them. That's fantastically important, because up to now, we've never known what questions to ask. So we've not asked them. We've just assumed that these systems work and that they will always work and that they're not biased and that they're accurate. And we believe the tech companies when they tell us that they're perfect. And they're not. There's none of them perfect. So some conclusions. We know almost nothing about the AI scoring systems currently in use. You look at any of those tests that are out there that are using AI, we know nothing about their systems. We've never asked, and they've never told us. We're both wrong. We're wrong for not asking, they're wrong for not telling us. However, I think model cards, they offer us a realistic approach to model validation. And I think they are the beginning, at least, of a way forward. And we are arguing that it should be used across language testing. In fact, in the British Council now, any project that is planning to integrate AI scoring of any kind must put into the tender process the development of a model card. So the companies who are tendering to work with us must produce a model card to show us how they built the system and how they've evaluated the system. The process offers us an opportunity to develop a common language and common expectations. And I think that's the critical bit, that we've learned how to talk to each other. And I think we've gained massively from the project in terms of learning about AI and learning how to communicate with AI developers. But I think for everybody else and anybody listening, I would question everything about the AI models used in commercial tests. Don't take them for granted. It's probably going to cause you problems down the line. And I'll stop talking now and I'll take some questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Barry. I'm gonna look at YouTube right now for any of the questions posed on the chat box here. At the moment, I'm only seeing about roughly 178 people watching, but there are no questions at the moment. Is that right, Nadia?
Yeah, that's right. At the moment, we don't have any questions. Probably we do have some questions from you, Aisha.
Well, I was just looking at, what you mentioned about questioning the exam boards on human scores,
Yes.
right? Because I find that quite intriguing, as well as, that would be the case if we are following a sample of marked papers, for instance. So we are just basing off of a model that a committee or an exam board have listed out, like you said. So in that particular case, regardless of the AI, even for every other assessment that we do, be it a human one or a mixture of both, how would we, be able to question this if it's something that is brought to you by authority, for example?
Well, I think what we have to do, and it's one of the reasons organizations like MALT and UCALTA and EALTA and ILTA are there for, and that is to inform ministries about the positive side of AI, but also about the potential negatives. And ministries generally they're influenced by a small number of people. So they're the influencers, I always like to call them. And the influencers are the people that we need to influence ourselves. We need to get to them, and we need to say to get the right messages to them. So an awful lot of this is about communication. So one of the reasons we have just what I would call a semi-technical model card, for example, is that I can bring that 2-page document to an influencer to demonstrate to the influencer the kind of questions that he or she should be suggesting that the ministry ask. And certainly if there was a move at any point to introduce a testing system, let's say to Malaysia, let's say part of the MOAT was going to be an scoring speaking test or writing test. Well, the questions I would be asking from day one will be, how was the model developed? Who were the people that it was, who performed the samples, the language samples? What was the population like? How did the company ensure that the population that was used to build the model reflected the actual population who would be taking the test? So were there Malaysian students from sort of 16 to 18? Were they reflective of the different social groups within and ethnic groups within the country? Is the gender balance right? So I would be asking those questions. I would then say, who did the human scoring? Who were these people? How many were they? How did you calculate? How did you estimate the reliability of their scores? These are all the questions that we're asking in the model card. And the same for the evaluation. How do you know it works? How can you prove to me that it works? And there is no bias in the system. So when we did our model card, we ran ANOVAs to look for bias, 3-way ANOVAs we were looking at. And we also looked at multifaceted Reich bias analysis. So we did 2 different systems to show us that there was no bias in our test.
I mean, it
We
seems to
still
me,
found problems. We
right.
found problems in our own test, partially because the sample data that was used got the age quite slightly wrong.
Yeah.
But it didn't have a big difference on the score, but it's still an issue that we're looking to. We're actually putting more data into the system now at the right age group.
That's fantastic. I think the bulk would be to be critical in your testing and evaluation. Those questions are indeed very pertinent questions, and I just don't recall any type of testing examination that uses an AI at the moment that I haven't experienced with in Malaysia, but those are some important issues or questions to ask first before introducing, like you said, the pure AI type of question or testing. Here, I'm looking at the chat box and there are suddenly two questions coming up. The first one is from Pierre. Pierre is from APB UITM Shalom, Pierre Moreau. He is saying, or he said, "Hi, Dr. Berry. Don't you think it is extremely subjective when we state that one system of evaluation is good and another one is a failure? In terms of subjectivity, when we compare two tests or evaluation."
Yes. Most tests that are out there will have some strengths. So, you know, I may not like, for example, a Duolingo test. Its strength is that it doesn't need any human interaction. It automatically generates its own items and it automatically scores those items. Now that's a big strength. It means that the test can be run for almost nothing. So even if they charge a lot less than other tests, it's almost pure profit. There's very little other costs related to it. That's great. It's a great business model. In the same way, the old TOEIC test was a great business model. It was a lousy test. You know, I guess there's a different way of looking at it. We look at it in the the European perspective, and for those countries influenced by Europe, we tend to look at the construct. What are we testing? That's the big question. Whereas in the US model and the US countries that have been influenced by the US, it's the measurement model. So we look at it from two different perspectives. So the very suggestion, for example, that you start building an auto-scoring system by creating tasks that the system can deal with, for us is anathema. It's absolutely the wrong thing to do. So I think there is obviously some level of subjectivity. You know, let's face it, we all have our opinions, and an opinion is always going to be subjective to some extent. But I would certainly argue very much against a measurement-driven approach. I argue always that we need measurement, but measurement supports construct. It's not the other way around. You can't just measure something and then try to figure out what you're testing. And that's what, if you look at some of the more recent reports, internal reports from Duolingo, and I keep coming back to Duolingo because it's a good example, you can see that they're trying to retrofit a theoretical rationale for the test. It's too late, folks.
Yes.
The test doesn't actually measure language use. At the very most, it measures language capability or capacity. And I don't believe it measures that, because it's based on a structuralist approach. And structuralism was a failed philosophy 100 years ago. Actually, the guy who started it died 110 years ago, but it died with him, and it should have been left with him. It was only resuscitated in the 1950s and 60s to support claims of construct validity.
I think I agree with you when you mentioned about measurement that are based on constructs, not the other way around. We have the second question here coming from Suba. Suba Rathinasamy would like to ask, what should be taken into consideration when we administer pen and paper based test in an online platform, especially in relation to time allocation?
I know Suba very well. Hello, Suba. Nice to hear a question from you.
Yeah, she actually said, "Hi, Barry, you're looking good today."
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, we're old friends. Yes, what are the things? That's a really interesting question, because you know, I was looking at the IELTS, for example. And I do some work with IELTS these days, but I didn't have anything to do with the IELTS indicator test, which was essentially a reflection of the need to build an online version of IELTS very quickly and get it out so that people could, because basically universities in the UK were demanding that IELTS do something quickly because they had people needed to take a test. But what they did was they just took the original pencil and paper test and put it online. There was absolutely no change. It is exactly the same test, the same items, the same everything. They didn't make, in the same way as in the actual IELTS test, you are given, let's say, 2 and a bit hours, and you have, let's say, 40 minutes or 45 minutes to do a reading section. It's timed in the same way as the original test. There's no additional work done. So, and for me, that's just sad, because there's so much you can do to do things better. So one of the projects that we engaged in last year during the pandemic was we actually created a series of expeditious reading tasks. So speeded, timed reading tasks. And we built those with the view that at some point in the next couple of years, certainly year and a half, we will look to introduce those to IELTS online. So what we're trying to do now is we're saying, it's not a great idea to take a pencil and paper test and put it online without actually investigating what online can give you. And online can give you things like timing, particular activities. You can build a timing in very simply to the system, and it works. Expeditious reading is a perfect example of what you can do. We've also created integrated tasks for speaking and for writing. And again, we can introduce timing into that. There's all kinds of stuff we can do. So my suggestion there is, if you're thinking of putting a pencil and paper test online, you have two options. One option is just put it on and don't make any changes to timing. You have your biggest question, of course, is you don't want your test to become a typing test. And I remember my great friend Cyril Weir was once asked to take a Versant test, and they said, they were going to pay him to write a review, and he tried to take the test. I probably shouldn't be saying this, but I've said it. He as he was trying to do it, Cyril typed with 2 fingers. It was like a machine gun, but 2 fingers. But it was slow. So he could never get to the finish of a task. He couldn't do the writing test. So he had to write back to them and say, I'm sorry, I can't type fast enough to do your test. So if you're going to introduce a typing test, you need to know how well your candidates can type. And that's a really important issue. So you may have to extend your writing, particularly test timing, depending on their ability to type. So that's the only change you can make relatively quickly, but you need evidence to do it. So you would probably need to trial your test without timings, just to give people as long as they need it to see how much they can actually physically type.
I think the challenge, or maybe just adding something to that, would be to have like some of the tests I've seen, they leave it open for a day, knowing that you only limit one response. And so the students or whoever is taking the test will have to think about in terms of time. But at the same time, the questions are not something that they can find online. So it's more critical in nature, I guess.
Yeah. If I knew that my test was going to be scored by a machine, and you gave me 1 day to create a text, I already today could create a text that guarantees me at least a level B1 score.
A level B1, huh? Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
because they can find it online.
Well, there's a particular website that's built by an American researcher that's designed to demonstrate how poor AI scoring systems can be. And you basically type in 3 words. So you take the prompt and you type in 3 words, and it will generate a text any length you decide.
Wow.
And you can take that, copy it, and paste it into your test paper, and you will get a score. Generally, in my experience, because I've done it, you get a score in that region of B1.
Wow.
It's gibberish.
Yes,
The,
yes.
the text is total gibberish. That's the whole point.
But
Because
then it was, yeah,
the
it was
systems
recognized
generally, yeah, because you've given it 3 key words, it'll pull out other similar words and stick them into the text. So the machine thinks they're using appropriate language.
Yeah.
So the machines are literally still their biggest weakness is understanding the content of what you've done and giving you a score for content or task fulfillment.
Right. They're
That's
just looking at
the weakness.
patterns.
It's just looking at patterns.
That's right. So, you know, that human intervention, like you use in the scorecards and that model, those are the human intervention that could supplement the AI or teach the computer things that
Absolutely.
in terms of the
Yes.
pattern. I'm just going to read, I think, 2 more questions
Yeah.
in the interest of time. Rose Yong Yen Mui, I hope I got your name correctly. How can we do our assessment and evaluation, especially during this pandemic, when we get less participation from our students during online teaching? That's a good question.
I think that's a massive challenge. And I think the big challenge is to individual teachers to actually think seriously about how and what you're assessing, and look at assessing in different ways. Maybe instead of having tests, like big bang tests at the end of a program, put in like micro tests in your system and build those tests into the system and let people know that these are going to contribute to your score and there will not be a test. So I think this whole pandemic has forced us all to think outside the box. And in some ways it's been great. You know, I know that some of the projects that we've been able to get to work on in the last year and continuing to work on at the British Council in our assessment research group, I don't think we would have got the permission to go ahead and do those kind of studies a few years ago because everything was settled. You know, IELTS was doing fine, and ACTUS was good, everything was fine. And there's no momentum for change.
Right.
Until something goes wrong.
Correct. It
When
just
it goes wrong, yes,
forces us to do something different.
absolutely. And I think that's the thing. I think just change, do something different, find different ways of assessment, and move away from the single big test. I think we should be doing that anyway, but that's another question.
That's another talk.
That's another
I think there's, let me get to the other question. This is from Dr. Ilya Johar. Hi, Dr. Barry. Don't you think it's extreme? Oh, sorry. So she was just forwarding Pierre's question. Let me get to Gaojing from UPN. Hi, Dr. Barry. How can we deal with the problem of cheating while students taking online testing? Do we need to make sure or do some modification of the test instructions in online assessments?
I think unless you've got a very expensive proctoring system, you're not going to stop online cheating. There's most of the systems I know, there's just too many people out there trying to beat those systems down. So generally, universities or smaller institutions can't afford the very expensive proctoring systems. So in that situation, what I would be suggesting is that we move away from the concept of the closed book test to the open book test. And we say, you know, like you said earlier, you've got a day to respond to this or a week to respond to this. Off you go. You can use any resource you like. You know, if we found you've plagiarized, of course you're going to fail, but you can use other resources and you can do what you like to respond to it. But the pass mark is 90%. So, you know, we expect you to do it, but we expect you to do it properly. And we expect that because you have time and you have your books, your textbooks open, everything is available to you, we expect really high levels of performance. So we wouldn't have a regular test scoring system where we agree that, you know, 60% is enough to pass, or 40% or 50% is enough to pass. That won't work. So you have to think outside the box and move away from the traditional. I think that's one of the big lessons we've learned in the last 2 years is the traditional way of doing things isn't going to work online.
I agree
We
with
have
you.
to think different.
Yep. So I think that's just perfect, right? Just reading the last few comments before we wrap things up. I'm just going to read the comments. Supa Retinasamy says that she thanks you for the detailed explanation, and she just wants to tell you that she was your PhD student back in 2002, 2006. Yep.
I remember her extremely well.
Okay, great. And she says, may Prof. Cyril Weir or Weir,
Yes.
Weir's soul rest in peace. And then all of them are just commenting on. Okay, one more thing from BPPA. Maybe this is from Nadia. We also have a video on open book assessment by Prof. Pramjit. So the viewers can go and visit that.
That's
Finally,
very good.
yeah, finally, if I may add, I mean, I know it's already time, but there's just one last question. Hi, Dr. Berry. How do we design an open book assessment for language courses? Maybe last few words from you.
Well, if you're looking at the open book test, for me, is production based. So you're either going to test speaking or writing. I don't believe you're wasting your time doing reading or listening, because, you know, if I have a day or 5 days to do a reading test, of course I'm going to get everything right. It's crazy thinking that I won't. But if I have 4 or 5 days or something to prepare a 10-minute talk, well, that's completely different. I still have to produce the talk. I still have to do it. So for me, that's what I would do. I would focus on the productive skills and forget about the others. People will use the other skills as part of their preparation anyway. I'm moving away very much from the direct assessment of receptive skills anyway. I think we should be focusing on language use. We should forget about the overly complex systems that we've developed. I've developed myself in the past. I'm guilty as much as everybody.
But yeah, change nonetheless, and we welcome these changes as we go post-pandemic. I'm afraid
Yes.
that's all the time for today's webinar. Once again, on behalf of MALT and UITM's Academic Assessment and Evaluation Division of BPPA, we'd like to thank everyone here for joining. Also, huge appreciation goes to Professor Dr. Barry O'Sullivan, Head of Assessment Research and Development at British Council, for making the time. Thanks again for being here, Prof.
Thank you for asking me. It's been a real pleasure.
Great. That is the end of our webinar today. I'm Aisha Johari, together with Nadia. Thank you, take care, and have a good weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.